All right. Hi. Hello, everyone. We're really excited to be here. My name is Avanti Croby. I am a part of the NOAC Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University, and I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm also part of this larger TA coalition that has been providing technical assistance to you over the last few weeks. Coalition includes the National League of Cities, America Achieves, Drexel University, Federation of American Scientists, and then Luminary Labs and Justice and Sustainability Associates. So we have a really great group coming together for the next 2 days, and I'm really excited to bring up our two presenters. Bruce Katz, he's the director of the NOAC Metro Finance Lab at Drexel, and then we'll be following with John Schnurr, who is the CEO of America Achieves. So with that, I think we can tee up our presentation, and then Bruce, I can pass it to you.
Well, thanks, Avanti. And so as the presentation comes up, I think we're in a remarkable moment here with this Build Back Better Regional Challenge. And go to the next slide. What this is doing is almost reverse engineering a national competitive agenda. The way in which EDA has structured this competition is allowing places, whether they're cities, counties, metros, regions, states, rural communities, to declare their unique competitive position and really devise a very broad set of solutions to meet them where they are, to leverage their opportunities, to meet their problems. Having been involved with the federal government in various enterprises over the decades, this is a very different kind of competition. And just so at the beginning, just applaud EDA for the way in which it's been structured, for the experimentation and imagination and aspiration that it's been helpful. It's helped to galvanize. So let's go to the next slide. When you look through these 60 applications and read all of them and others, what's clear is that you're telling a story of incredible disruption and volatility in our economy, particularly in advanced industries in our economy. Now, part of that story is really the pandemic itself, which on a nightly basis, if you watch the news, will tell us about supply chain resilience or the lack thereof, or remote work or inflation. But a lot of what you're describing in these applications really relate to some other elements that are affecting the moment. Policy changes to basically move towards more renewable power sources, or to electrify the auto sector, or to ensure that we are able to reshore our manufacturing base across multiple sectors. There are other dynamics that have been underway literally for decades, which are allowing new next generation technologies and sectors to emerge, whether it's the blue economy, whether it's the commercial space economy, but also technological advances that have been underway for quite some time, whether it's AI, whether it's robotics, whether it's machine learning, whether it's big data analytics, whether it's genomics, are washing across multiple sectors and really forcing compelling, more strategic, intentional and purposeful action. And we're not alone in the world. We all know that other countries, whether it's China, whether it's the Europeans, or whether it's India, are fundamentally focusing themselves on coming out of this pandemic stronger in ways that do respond to these disruptive dynamics, in some cases more centrally driven than a sort of a classic American way of operating, which is more networked, more distributed, more decentralized. Last thing I'll just say, there's a lot of private capital out there. So we're talking about a public competition for $1 billion, but there's enormous private capital that can be leveraged in this moment. So next slide. What we're seeing are really the elements of a competitiveness agenda that can be grown bottom up and ultimately implicate, as we'll talk about, John and I will talk about, multiple elements of federal government policy and then public, private, and civic action. There really are 5 elements that all of your applications are putting forward. And there's a linearity to this. There's a logic to this. What are your market strengths? What's your position in the domestic and global economy? Whether given a legacy industry or given the anchor institutions you have, universities, ports, hospitals, military labs, energy labs. What's the momentum you've had through various initiatives you've had underway? What's your problem statement? What's holding you back? I mean, we are talking about a country that has so many assets and advantages, and this is about unlocking them fully so that regions can grow in equitable, sustainable, and innovative ways, and then the country as a sum up of that can grow. What are the solutions that are aligned to your problem statement? And they cut across many different aspects. How do you bake in equity throughout? And as you'll see when we talk about equity, in some ways, you're defining equity more broadly, in a much more comprehensive way, in a much more integrated way than we've ever seen before. This is really exciting. And again, it shows the ability of what the US can do because it's bottom up, it's authentic, it's real. And then finally, how are you governing yourself? Economic development, particularly advanced economic development, is a team sport, right? And you're seeing coalitions emerge in various geographies and sustain themselves for the long haul. So next slide. This is Dolly Parton. Today she was nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but she may be our premier economic development thinker in the US because what she said is figure out who you are and do it on purpose. And to be frank, that's what many of your applications are doing. So from a market strength perspective, what are those historic and distinctive strengths, both within the domestic market, but also in the global market? And so many of these applications have used evidence and data and trends to basically tell a very powerful story about your competitiveness platform. These industries are under enormous pressure. It goes back to that disruptive dynamics slide. And again, the applications are talking about aspirational goals, but they're also being very concrete and specific about the challenges you face. In many cases, there have been initiatives underway. There is market momentum. There are elements where this application is allowing places around the country to build on what they've already done, take it much further, accelerate, broaden, deepen, et cetera. Very powerful. So the implication of all this is, I think we are seeing a new way of capturing regionally distinctive assets, and that is the strength of the United States. I mean, we are not a country, particularly like Europe, where everyone will look to the capital city, like a London or a Paris. We really have distribution. Next slide, problem statement. What's holding you back? So there are 2 types of problem statements. We obviously prefer one of them. One that covers everything, but doesn't really touch anything with great specificity, and one which really begins to drill in to those core binding constraints, to those issues that are fundamentally holding you back. I would say reading these applications, talent gaps, the technological pressures across multiple sectors is a constant, almost ubiquitous theme. But land constraints on the manufacturing side, capital constraints on entrepreneurial dynamism, governance mechanisms, particularly when you're talking about geographies that can span pretty large land masses, right? Not just cities, not just counties, not just metros, but whole regions, in some cases, whole states, in some cases, multiple states. So the implication is sharpen your problem statement, because in a linear logical way, when you start talking about solutions, they really build on those challenges you've described. Core solutions. Next slide. Former head of the Royal Society for Arts in the UK said, think like a system and act like an entrepreneur. That's what your applications are doing. You're thinking across the economy. You're thinking about labor. You're thinking about capital. You're thinking about land. You're thinking about research and commercialization. You're thinking about the networks between mature companies, startups, scale-ups, incubators, accelerators, community colleges. That's a system. And then you're basically saying, how do we act like an entrepreneur? How do we act at the speed of the market? How are we agile? How are we nimble? How do we take advantage of market dynamics? Or in some cases, try to mitigate their impact. So a lot of solutions are coming up here, which has broad effect across the whole government and our whole society. Funds and products to unlock local capital. And there are other federal programs like the State Small Business Credit Initiative that could be helpful here. Skills training that are company-led and cluster-led, the co-location of assets so that you can get the full synergistic effect between different disciplines and different entities. New models for network governance. Some places in the country have been at this for decades, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, but new models seem to be emerging. And then leveraging some of the existing programs we have out there. So the challenge as we all move forward here is how do we describe the solutions so that they both reflect back on the challenges that you've identified and then cohere, that it's not just 3 projects or 5 projects or 8 projects that all make sense in their own silo or stovepipe, but actually can come together. This is the 2 + 2 = 5 effect that we're seeing in so many of the applications that have been put forward. Next slide. Equity, equity, equity throughout. You can't manage what you don't measure. So this is implicating both how do we define equity across multiple dimensions. And if you read these applications, what's just so interesting is you're giving a kaleidoscope definition. You're really sort of expanding out what we think about equity and how, what are those strategies to reduce deeply rooted racial and ethnic income, health, wealth disparities across the country and spatial disparities. So you're talking about supplier diversity, critical given the level of federal spending. You're talking about workforce diversity. You're talking about founder diversity across multiple sectors. You're talking about governance diversity. You're talking about locational diversity, where you actually put facilities, in many cases, right up against high poverty neighborhoods or in parts of our country, rural communities and elsewhere that have been bypassed. So it's critical, and we're going to hear from Justice and Sustainability Associates later, to think about the multiple dimensions of equity and the strategies and the tactics, procedural equity, and then to really get into the evidence so we know we're making progress, that we can hold ourselves to ambitious goals. So this is, it's not like equity is something that is at the part of the coalition. It's, it's a particular, it's really baked throughout these applications as it should be. And I think this whole field of economic development in the service of inclusion is evolving rapid time because of this application and process. Next slide. Network governance. So we all know that to build your economies, to unlock the full potential, is going to require multiple players coming together. This is not a real estate developer building one building, right? This is not a stadia authority building a stadia. This is really the advanced industries of our country that require all these different anchor institutions and intermediaries and capital to be knitted together. Be an ecosystem, not an ecosystem. This is the phrase from Chris Calveron, the former mayor of West Sacramento. It encapsulates it. Good governance is something that happens in seriatim over time, almost in perpetuity. It's not one and done. You're not coming together for just this government competition. These are market strategies that basically need a platform and a foundation of governance. So principles for how you organize as you come together, meet to decide, not to discuss. These are not debating societies. You're doing stuff. You're doing great things, and they all need to pull together. Give folks assignments. If you need to crack the code on this strategy or that strategy, this is not a 6-month, 9-month, year, 60 days. Come back, specifics, concrete, metrics, goals, deliverables. It's really possible given the systems you're building. Multiple revenues. These are capital stacks. $100 million, the upper tier of what EDA can provide, sounds like a lot of money, but frankly, we all know it has to leverage billions, and it has to be complemented by other public, private, and civic investments, and model behavior around governance, collaboration, which sounds easy to do, but we all know is difficult, right? We're all coming out of different experiences, disciplines, fiefdoms, territories. We're trying to pull together. So again, we have that bigger effect. Use the projects and the specificity and the concreteness of what you're doing to drive good governance. Next slide. Whole economy response. So this is a platform, this Build Back Better regional challenge. And many of the applications, I would say all of the applications, understand that this is not the limit to the capital that you need to build out your special distinctive parts of the economy. So use Build Back Better as a seed investment to leverage private and philanthropic funds. It's out there. Folks are already coming to the table from the corporate sector, from the foundation sector, and beyond to realize that they need to be part of the capital stack. Galvanize anchor commitments. You've got universities, you've got hospitals, you've got major globally significant corporations, you've got ports, you've got airports, you've got military bases, you've got energy labs. What are their commitments? You know, it's not just a matching requirement for a particular application. This is about long-term economic competitiveness. So what, as different institutions see their role, see their place, how can they further unlock their assets, work harder for your clusters? Leverage federal infrastructure funding. Yesterday, the White House, or maybe it was on Monday, put out a guide to infrastructure, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That could complement, that could buttress so much of what you're talking about here. And obviously R&D funding, whether it's from DOD, whether it's NSF, whether it's NIH, whether it's the ARPA, DARPA, whatever the new acronyms are, leverage that up and use federal funding to leverage private capital. There's a volume of private capital out there looking for smart investments, and the knitting together of those private funds with the industry clusters you're talking about, the young firms that can begin to start and scale. This is a moment for this country that you can galvanize. Last slide. All of this comes together, next slide. All of this comes together in places. This is a mock-up of what an urban innovation district would look like, because these relatively small geographies really do combine and co-locate and experience and really catalyze the synergies across workforce, across commercialization, across mixed-use development, across supplier diversity, and on and on and on. This is how our economy pops, is when we really have geographies either at the innovation district scale or the distributed decentralized scale, which is true for many of our advanced clusters, where you can marry together R&D, production, prototyping, export, trade, distribution, logistics, all together. So diagram out really your geography and show in a very visual way how all these projects can ultimately cohere. Again, it has been a privilege an absolute privilege to work with so many of you and to read these phenomenal applications. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thanks, Avanti. My name again is John Schnurr, CEO of America Achieves, and we're so pleased to be part of this coalition supporting all of you in the Build Back Better Regional Economic Challenge. Bruce and Avanti and the Drexel team, National League of Cities, Federation of American Scientists, and America Achieves are partnering with EDA, with the national headquarters and the regional offices, to play a role, as you know, in supporting you as you go through this phase of getting to your application deadline by March 15th. And Bruce described the inspiration that he and I think all of us are feeling from reading your applications and from speaking with you. As of the last 2 weeks, we now have read all your 60 applications. We've had more than 50 one-on-ones, and we'll get the last 8 to 10 in the next few days by video with you. And we're learning a lot and seeing a lot. In the next few minutes, we're going to get to next some brass tacks. I'm going to share what we've heard from you, number one, in these conversations in the survey. Number two, and I'll get that in just a moment, and review. The second after that, we'll talk about what the 5 driving questions are that we're supporting you in this technical assistance. And then 3, kind of go a little bit more in depth for a couple minutes on one area of focus in this session around how you really get at the strategic coherence to align to what your North Star is, so the projects really become the 2 + 2 = 5 that Bruce is saying. So what did we learn from you? Start with a little data first, and then I'll get a bit more to just our impressions. We did the survey, and you all filled out. Thank you for the generosity of your time. And on the left, you see you rated yourself most strongly in your application on having a demonstrated growth sector, having clear regional assets, having a clear problem statement. You're still sharpening those. But the 2 areas that you described as being not quite as far along in many cases, needing more help, is this notion of cohesive projects on one hand, and how each project really aligns to a very clear value proposition about economic input, impact, economic output, what your competitive industry cluster is, what the problems are that you're trying to overcome that keep you from fulfilling that vision, and how your projects all totally aligned to those. You've identified that as an area of needed support. In fact, one of you in a session the other day described this as, by the round 1 deadline, you had a lot of the ingredients together. Now the ingredients have been marinating, and now there's the time that we're trying to bring them together in the recipe that can kind of get to the whole creation, the chef's creation that will lead to economic impact. So I know this is a critical moment that you've identified, because if you don't, and if you are working on this, get clear on your overarching value proposition and strategy. Then in the remaining weeks, you finish your project applications. Each of those applications won't align to that. So we agree with you that this is a critical area that you're working on. You got a lot of insight, and we're trying to support you on. The second one, if you look at the bottom of the slide, is around data and evidence. You're saying that you could use help on really the data and the evidence supporting your strategy. And a lot of you have a lot, but I would say that as we've read your 60 applications, we think that's true as well in a couple ways. One is you need to make sure you can actually have clear goals with ways to measure data on progress in terms of your overall economic impact, jobs, equity. That's true. But we also are seeing, like you're seeing, that as you support your argument for a cohesive, clear industry cluster and a set of strategies that align to that, having the clear evidence about why you are well positioned as an industry cluster to succeed, what the barriers are that you've actually seen from actually engagement with employers, what's keeping industry for existing firms from growing, what's keeping you from bringing new firms in, what's keeping new firms from starting up, what is the evidence about those barriers that then actually lead you to what your strategies and projects are. We do think that data and evidence is crucial, and it will help support why and how this in fact can fulfill the selection criteria around regional impact and economic growth in jobs and regional investment, without which the projects by themselves won't succeed. If you go to the next slide on what else we've heard from you, on the next slide, if you go to the next slide, there are a set of things that you've shared in the conversations, building on the data. The first one I've already mentioned, so I won't repeat that. But the second, you talked about this bottoms-up approach toward American economic competitiveness that Bruce described. The opportunity and the challenge is, how do you manage the realities of diverse coalitions? while aligning to that North Star. And practically, what does that look like? What does the governance look like, which we'll talk about during these couple of days and during our individual sessions? But how do you kind of manage the diversity of the coalitions, which is crucial in the context of a North Star goal? Equity, you've made clear that there's you have real interest and need in supporting a focus on equity, including defining very clear outcomes for equity, including historically underserved communities, as well as bringing kind of equity-driven organizations really being part of the overall creation process of this. On the outcomes front, I would just note here that what you're doing around economic competitiveness and equity and bringing them together reflects the data about what's needed in the country. Some of you may have seen this, but there's data showing that between 1960 and 2010, that 40% of our GDP in the country, the growth, it came to greater participation of women and people of color in the labor force, including through improved talent allocation. And that kind of some improvement in equity has led to greater GDP and economic competitiveness. And as we know, we've got a lot of equity issues outstanding that are significant. So I think your applications and your conversations are showing to us your vision of really driving economic competitiveness being absolutely interlinked and interconnected with your equity strategy. You can't get to economic competitiveness without leveraging the diversity of your communities. And you can't get to an equity strategy without actually growing the pie through smart, inclusive economic growth. So you're blending these two together and you're looking for support. Doing that is absolutely tracking what we are learning and doing as a country at our best. Second to last on this page, you've made clear that you're looking to figure out how to help leverage other financial support resources, including private capital, including other public funding, including philanthropy. And there's no question that this competition is not a government program, interestingly, and you're alluding to this here. It's a government program supporting, as Bruce is describing, a local ecosystem, creating a sustainable industry. And so you are describing in your plans, looking for support for how do you make sure that the sector is appealing to investors? How do you bring in outside investors that see this as a good investment strategy? What will it take to actually bring in and grow the firms that are needed in order to be able to fulfill the vision of your cluster? So you're looking for help in financial sources, which we'll be getting to as well. And finally, you did note the key question on talent. That ultimately one of the things that is an overarching strategy across your projects is making sure you've got the diverse talent pipeline to support your strategy. The next slide on driving questions for our support for you. Throughout these 2 days, we're going to be diving into different questions. We're not going to dive into all these right here, but the 5 that I think you've seen in our one-on-one sessions with you. Number 1, which we're talking about here, is the competitiveness of your cluster and economic impact. Second is the strategic and project alignment and coherence, how these all add up to support your overall impact. Third is equity. And how do you both advance equitable outcomes, demonstrable, measurable economic outcomes with an equity focus, and have underserved communities and groups involved in the process, centrally involved in the process of creating this work. Fourth is governance and leadership. How are you going to organize yourselves to execute, not just the project level, but at the overall coalition level, including who makes what decisions, staffing, how do you make sure you're gathering information data along the way to drive not just each project by project, but drive the whole coalition and sector over time. And fifth is kind of the financial budget and staffing plan. What is your financial strategy? What is your budget? And what's the staffing that actually is going to allow you to support not just the projects, but the coalition? In this session, I'll spend just a few last minutes before we go to questions. If we go to the next slide of bringing this to life in your region, we're going to spend time especially on this question of strategic and project coherence. In other sessions, we're going to go into the equity, we're going to go into the governance, we're going to go into the commitments you can get. But I just want to pause on this for a moment because you've said this is a key need. We've said this, but let me just take a couple minutes to describe both what's on and beyond this slide in terms of what we're seeing driving effectiveness in some of the most effective regions of the country. And that is when you, and your overarching narrative and your project application, first question for all of this is, what is your North Star? What are the measurable outcomes? What's the economic output? What are the jobs? And these are selection scoring criteria, but they're also crucial for your region. What is your definition of your cluster? And in defining that North Star, making the argument why your cluster, in fact, can be competitive. What's the market demand for that? What's the assets you're bringing? And then as part of your North Star, not only of your cluster, but if you go to the second bullet, what's your overall value proposition of this strategy? That is, what evidence do you have that there actually are limitations on bringing new firms to your region, growing existing firms, starting new firms? what's the evidence on the barriers to fulfilling the vision of that cluster, so that then that informs your value proposition as a plan and proposal. So if you've got a workforce strategy, you've got a supply chain strategy, you've got an infrastructure, you've got an R&D and commercialization strategy. In many cases we see in the country, those are discrete projects. In this case, what you are in the process of doing is in being clear, the barrier to growing firms is this kind of lack of this kind of facility, do you do testing, or this kind of commercialization of research, or we've these types of jobs specifically in this sector and skills, and here's the talent strategy that's needed to do that. So what have the firms identified as barriers to growth, and what is your fundamental value proposition to address those, so that you're very clear, not only in your cluster, but on what is the overall strategic bet you're making and set of bets to address those needs. For some of you, that's very obvious and clear, but I'll just pause for a moment and say, we also know that talking to you, you're racing through this. And again, somebody said they got the ingredients, but they're marinating, trying to create the recipe. We know there are a lot of project partners who are coming in who often are focused in many ways on their own project and are in the process of aligning to what that North Star vision and value proposition. So we can't overstate the importance of this phase of not only a couple people in this in the writing of this application, but for you as a coalition and partners to really align behind this clear North Star, this clear value proposition, so that when you're actually writing your project applications, each of them can really align toward what that North Star is, and that you can then have things like governance and coalition building aligned to that North Star as well. So then the third bullet, when you look at each ingredient project, the crucial, and it looks at how effective each project is designed, what are the workforce strategies, what are the entrepreneurship strategies, but at the top of those, what's the outcome from each of those projects that actually aligns to what the barrier is that industry and firms are in the community is saying is impeding economic growth. So what's the outcome of each of those? Then how does each of those projects align to that outcome that is tightly linked with evidence toward those barriers is key. And then in this, making sure you've got a very pragmatic plan, including funding if you so choose. EDA has made clear that they will fund staffing, governance, planning. How do you make sure you've got the funding to organize and support your coalition's execution? And what's the leadership in the center, and what's the staffing of the center that will keep the eye on the North Star and generate research, track data, keep coalition together, ensuring clear communications decision-making to make sure that your North Star is not just in the application, but it's actually living every day, as some of you are, but many of you are working on, especially in the areas of emerging growth and sectors and clusters in your economy, making sure that there is a center of gravity in a very concrete way that brings together the execution toward your North Star. So that's kind of some of the things we're seeing, and many of you are doing well, but many of you are struggling in very pragmatic ways and working on how to do this, and we'll continue that in our support for you, which on my last slide, I'll then briefly summarize our coalition support for you. We're so grateful to EDA and for the partnership with our coalition, and to all of you for your generosity and time, making time for this. But the path forward in terms of our assistance, we've got sessions today and tomorrow. And if you look at that slide, those 5 questions, many of the sessions will go more in depth on particular questions, including equity and including governance, including commitments. Coming out of tomorrow, we'll have finished our 61st sessions with you, and we'll be in touch in the coming days with both a brief follow-up survey to you and an overview of next steps for our one-on-one and one-on-group engagement between now and March 15th. Third, there will be guidance on securing specific high-level commitments from coalition partners. The Federation of American Scientists will have a session on that with America Achieves later in this convening. There'll be guidance coming out in support, including one-on-one sessions to help you as you think about what kind of commitments can be made. We also will be giving you a resource library. In fact, at the end of this deck, there is an appendix with some initial excerpts of articles, case studies, kind of concrete examples of what we're talking about. That is at the end of this case study, but we'll also be sending out information on a resource library that you can draw on by topic and by questionnaire soon. And we'll have webinars on topics of interest to you and other tools to support you, as well as weekly office hours with EDA. But let me just, before I close and turn it to Avanti and for then ample time for Q&A and discussion, let me just close by, in a way, what you all have started with support from EDA, which is there's an urgent need in the country for greater economic competitiveness in the face of the most disruptive economy in history and the most rapidly changing economy in history. There's an urgent need and opportunity to advance outcomes for equity purposes across the country. And to do that, the economic development that you all are leading is not your grandfather's economic development. This is not even your father's and your mother's economic development. This is a very different kind of economic development in terms of what you're building, cluster by cluster, how you're building it. And we know that's hard. It's hard, it's messy, it's difficult. But at the end, the leadership at the center of this and the work that you all are doing that are really what will help not only your region, but the country deliver on the opportunity here. So when we look back in history, I think as the Assistant Secretary has been saying in recent days, you're not only living through history, but you all are making history, and we're really pleased to be supporting you in that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Avanti and for Q&A and for discussion.
Hey. Great. Thank you so much, Bruce and John, for that really wonderful presentation. We'll now move into Q&A, and I really want to encourage other audience members who are watching. You can still submit questions, so please let us know what you're thinking about and how we can address that here. We have like a few technical questions, around SSBCI capital or workforce innovation training funds, if those can be used as a match or not. And I'll leave that to the EDA to answer for that more technical approach. But that does have me thinking, that there are these other existing federal programs that clearly all of you are thinking about that's very applicable here. And I'm wondering, Bruce or John, what are the complementary federal programs that are standing out to you guys as you kind of do these TNA sessions? And, you mentioned how BBRC can really, seed this investment. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on how these all can really work in concert together?
John, do you want me to start, or?
You start, Bruce, and I'll follow.
Okay, so, when you think about the different elements of your applications, whether it's workforce development, whether it's supplier diversity, whether it's entrepreneurship, whether it's infrastructure, all of those different elements obviously have other federal programs that are either existing or in some cases are new or topped up. And so I think, in many respects, this EDA application is an enormous potential for platform funding that enables you to lever, have access to, complement other forms of federal funding, and also leverage private and civic capital. Let's just take State Small Business Credit Initiative. This is a $1.5 billion investment after the Great Recession. It's been scaled to $10.5 billion. It is most likely to have a 7x or 10x effect on private capital. So we're talking about $70 to $100 billion plus. This can be used to help young firms grow. 10 years ago, many parts of our country, and this is driven through the states, made early stage investments in companies that were coming out of their distinctive clusters in cities, metros, and regions. 10 years later, many of those countries have grown at scale. Some have become unicorns, right? This is an enormous possibility to have capital apply to young firms that are emerging from some of the most advanced industry clusters in the country. At the same time, this version of State Small Business Credit Initiative is putting special emphasis on SETI, socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, and small businesses. So it's compelling states to look at a broader continuum of capital for a broader continuum of enterprises and really take away some of the binding constraints, particularly around growing diverse firms, either in the founder space or in the supplier space. So message to everyone who's on this webinar, go find the person in your state who has either, or the agency who has either already submitted an application to the US Department of Treasury. The applications, the final applications are due by February 11th, but post-application, really find a way for your ecosystem to work closely with the state and work closely with private investors and financial institutions on removing capital from the constraints that are going to apply here. So that's just one of many programs that obviously complement and potentially could be operated, delivered in tandem with Build Back Better.
I think it's so right. Let me just add to that as well. And I will, my caveat on this is that any answer we provide and talk, if there's 60 applicants, should be, we are reminded that in a bottoms-up, leader-driven local strategy, everything we say looks different across 60 regions, from federal funding to governance. I mean, this is more laying out menus for you and principles, and you all will figure out what makes sense in your community. That said, on the federal funding, on the menu, I would just underscore, and building on what Bruce said, there is very concretely, there is, as you know, American Rescue Plan put out $350 billion in state and local economic aid that governors and counties and states and counties and cities have access to. I think some of you have looked to your executives in your state or region to provide funding for to help reflect the regional investment that is valued very much in this competition. Regional investment is one of the key criteria. And so looking at the state, county, and local use of ARPA funding, that's something you could do even before March 15th if you haven't, in order to show that regional investment, but certainly after. On infrastructure funding, there are clearly a lot of the projects that you are looking at that will be needed to sort of unlock your vision will be infrastructure. And obviously this is a time when infrastructure funding is now coming, and there's going to be a lot of opportunity there. There's workforce funding, can't go through the whole list, but there's funding coming out of the Department of Labor, but there's also training funding coming out of some of the other agencies around science and tech and STEM. You could leverage on a workforce strategy. Some of this, you have to think what realistically you can do between now and March 15th. And some of this, I think, underscores the need for you all having a kind of a center, or maybe 2 or 3 centers, but of gravity for your coalition, because even after the application, you're going to want at the center of your work a team to be looking at, what are all these opportunities across our coalition, across our projects? What do we do next with infrastructure funding? What do we do next with workforce funding? So I think there's needs you can look at now, but I think it's also a reminder of having a team at the center for you. You can be looking at opportunities in the coming weeks and months will also be critical.
Great. Thank you so much. I think there's another question here about, if EDA can think about different components to fund, would you guys recommend that they think about one of the components focusing on overall coalition governance? And, I know just through these TA sessions that governance has been a topic that's come a lot in our TA sessions. So really, any advice or recommendations you guys have on how applicants can think about going about with that, and whether that should be more ingrained in project strategy.
Bruce, I'm happy to go, or I'm happy to follow you.
Why don't you start, and then I'll come at the back end.
Great. So I guess maybe this is also a good time to underscore, and Scott Andes will often, in addition to other important leadership and signals he's providing, underscore as well the need just to keep looking at the scoring criteria, just from the application competitiveness perspective, make sure this will be looked at within the north, kind of the 4 corners of what the scoring criteria are. And so you have to decide what makes sense to achieve those goals in terms of economic growth and jobs and regional impact and equity and kind of coalition and cluster-wide outcomes that you're looking for. That said, to get there, however you address this, some mechanism to ensure there's good execution and ongoing decision-making across your coalition will be important. And you'll need, this doesn't replace the need for absolutely aligned and effective individual projects. And that's gonna be another session tomorrow with the EDRs and a member of the coalition looking at effective projects. That said, Scott's also made clear that funding can be used as part of broader projects or for its own project for governance and staffing. And however you do it, I think our perspective is you should have a clear strategy for how you're going to make decisions, how you're closing to work together, how you're going to staff it, and having funding in either as part of an existing project, which some of you are doing, but looking at expanding, or a new project that you haven't had yet, we think is important in order to help you ensure all the moving parts get the 2 + 2 = 5 that Bruce was alluding to earlier. How you do that's up to you.
Yeah, I think it's so important that the signaling, just building on what John said, the signaling that EDA is making about the criticality of governance as a platform, as a foundation, as a catalyst. In the US, we have a long history of convention center authorities and tourism agencies and business improvement districts. And the whole theory is that these entities are creating value for their communities, and therefore they should be able to access, taxes across multiple dimensions or use tax increment financing to forward fund infrastructure. Everyone on this webinar, the applications you have put forward are creating value, market value, tax revenues for the communities in which you're located. So I think as a catalyst, it's absolutely fundamental, for EDA to basically say, we should be helpful with your philanthropies, with your state and local governments, with your corporations to provide stable, predictable funding for network governance. Going forward, I think we got to create a model. This could be the catalyst to do it, of tapping into some of that market value that's being created so that there's long-term sustainability for the networks you're building. This is really, I think, a critical part of the competitive agenda.
Great, thank you. There's another question here from a region that's asking, what advice can you offer to help them overcome challenges that are clear limiting factors for economic growth in the region, but they're just too large for this EDA opportunity to significantly alter? And there's an example here where the region is remote and most of the target communities pay 5 to 10 times the national average for cost of electricity. They would probably need about 500 million to address the inequitable cost differential in electricity. So what would your advice be here on how to overcome things like that maybe are beyond what this EDA opportunity can do?
Well, to some extent, it builds on what John and I were talking about. There's $65 billion in the infrastructure bill on electric grid modernization. There's $65 billion in the infrastructure bill on modernizing the broadband system in the United States. So to some extent, I think what these applications are part of a bigger market strategy. They're an element of it where EDA funding can go to address certain constraints, but other constraints like the ones you're mentioning could ultimately be impacted by other federal funding and, again, private and civic capital. So I think it's absolutely essential to sort of have that big, it's almost like a Russian doll effect, that big market strategy that is identifying all the binding constraints or really extraordinary opportunities given the disruptive dynamics underway. The EDA application fits within that, and some of these other investments could also buttress and complement.
Just to underscore that this kind of reminds us that as large and important as these grants are from EDA, these grants are small compared to the total capital and the overall strategy that you all will be deploying. And that's partly why thinking about other funding sources is important. It's also partly why this question on governance coalition building, you want to have a kind of a guiding center. And there's various models for doing it. It's not the same model in every place. But along the way, how do you make sure you see other barriers beyond this? How do you define those? How do you as a coalition go after those? How do you go for extra resources that are coming out of the Infrastructure Act or coming out of various state funding sources? And I think this highlights the success in 5 years is not just successful execution of the projects that you're outlining, which obviously is crucial, but success is economic impact, it's jobs, and it's really significant sustainable growth of an industry cluster that will then have leveraged vast resources that go well beyond this EDA program. So I think you're right to raise it. and right to make that front and center, even if you don't have an answer yet by March 15th, you've got a mechanism to make sure you're looking at that and making sure you're bringing those resources to support a sustainable cluster over time.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question here and then give people a little bit of break before next session. But I think this is a really good question about, most regions in a way have more than one cluster. And so to what extent should they be referencing or, at least showing that they're aware of other existing and emerging sectors and, how that might affect the one that they're focusing on in this application?
We've actually had this conversation with many of the applicants because, one of the central disruptive dynamics of the 21st century is really the convergence of multiple clusters and multiple components of your economies. Technologies are sweeping across so many industries right now. I mean, the Internet of Things, the fourth industrial revolution, the auto sector are basically computers on wheels. I mean, we could just keep going with multiple euphemisms here. So bottom line, most of these applicants are in economies that are not one-trick ponies. They have multiple assets, multiple advantages, and you've been at that for a while. So in some cases, applicants have basically put forward the whole, right? I mean, multiple sectors, and tried to identify disruptive technological changes that sweep across. In other cases, applicants have been working on the whole, have been working on the convergence economy across, aeronautics or energy or health science, but they've decided to go deep into one because they see that as having an enormous potential given the dynamics underway with reshoring perhaps or with other critical factors. So bottom line, I think what's important, and this is why a bottom-up national competitive agenda is so compelling, help the reviewers understand your starting point, understand that there are these linkages across these advanced industry clusters given technological advances and proximity and all the rest, and then lay out, justify, articulate why you've either decided to, to look at A, B, or C. But, this is really, sort of advanced economic development thinking playing out in real time. And our conversations, frankly, over the past week have shown that everyone is making these critical choices. Just, make them explicit is my recommendation.
I agree. And I'll just add, totally agree, Bruce. I think the question is a really important question. It reflects maybe two things, I would say. One is that your cluster that you're proposing and planning is an important part, but only part of any regional economy. This is not the same as the economic strategy for the region, obviously. And a big thing about the context is important, and how this fits into that context that reflects that reality. The second point, though, I'd say, while there may be times you may want to refer to other sectors for reasons, for very, very specific reasons, I think the second point is, though, in terms of the application, I would recommend staying focused on this. You only have a limited number of words, you got a limited number of points to make, and I think that in the end, getting back to this part of the point of this session, define what's your North Star, what's sustainable, inclusive economic growth look like, what's the impact, what's the jobs, what are the fundamental barriers that are keeping firms from coming to your region, from growing, from starting, and how you got a set of bets that are aligned to trying to overcome those barriers and build on your assets. You don't have that much space to make the argument. So generally, I think my advice as a member of the Technical Assistance Coalition would be stay as focused as you can on making your core arguments for why this will be successful and how. And when you convert other things, but do so for a reason. I think one risk to you in your application development and in the risk and in the project, in the strategy overall, is there'll be lots of specific ideas of things that could be referred to, and even lots of different projects, some which might not align as much. And part of, I think, for you all, the opportunity is to stay aligned to your North Stars. You can look back and say several years from now that, you know, as the Assistant Secretary has been saying, you've made history. You've had bottoms up, American competitiveness, equity driven, created in successful growth clusters with kind of a focus that it's taken to pull that off. And I think that keeping that focus throughout your coalition, including this period leading from March 15th, we think is going to be critical.
Great. Thank you so much. And, you know, I think with just a few minutes left before the next session, we'll let people grab some coffee or whatnot. But Bruce, John, thank you so much for engaging with this. I think this is a really great conversation. And for everyone else, hang tight. I think the next session will begin shortly. So thank you.